Something that I thought was kind of funny about the way to level a book for a student is to sort of look at it, say, is it like this other book? And then go ahead and make a decision based on that. So it has less to do even with individual sentences or individual words or dialect or some of the things that might make a book unique or special. But much more to do with, is it like this book that you could expect a kid to read in a regular grade level reader? Um, I thought that the idea of benchmark books, if they can read one of these, then they can probably read, 10 or 15 of these that are very similar. I thought that's a really efficient way to say to a kid, okay, well, if you don't like this one, well, here's the next one and the next one after that. I really liked the informal assessment idea of far observation versus near observation, which is something which I think pretty much any teacher is already doing already, but that is also being discussed with a more technical edge here, where far observation is where you can sit at your desk and scan over the whole room and look and see which kids are subvocalizing, which kids aren't turning pages, which kids are staring off into space. Those are probably the kids who you need to do a so-called near observation with. Maybe running records are appropriate, or a conference about what they struggle with reading. I just think that's such an efficient, expedient way to get done what needs to get done, especially in a class of more than 20 people. I know we all read these books not just because they are assigned, but because occasionally you'll run across something that's just a great idea that you want to steal. And the great idea that I wanted to steal from this chapter was actually found in an article from Gambrell and Maronac, but which is being sort of talked about here. On the teacher's desk, it says, is a small stack of books that she will quote unquote bless today. The blessings are blessedly brief, just a few seconds each. The teacher holds up the book and mentions the title and offers a few words of information or response to the book and then moves on to another. What a good idea. It is so difficult for students to find books that they don't know about. I would challenge you at this precise moment to think about the last 15 books you read and think about how you learned about them. For me, it's a matter of Amazon recommendations or recommendations from people I know or lists that I read back in 8th grade or something, but I didn't come across them accidentally. Somehow I found them based on what I was reading or based on what people were talking to me about. And I think this is a really great way to so efficiently just say, here are the books that you might be interested in. Here's a little bit why. Go read it yourself. I'm not telling you anymore. One of the things that I liked about the Allington chapter was that he let off very quickly with this idea that adults tend not to like reading things that are too difficult for them. So when you ask a group of adults, even college-educated adults, as Allington notes, they tend to decide that they don't want to read the hard stuff, which I think bears out in our own experience. I think most of us would rather read a beach book than James Joyce. And we criticize students for not jumping for joy at the more difficult stuff is a little bit hypocritical when you think about in our own lives we try to avoid the harder stuff as much as possible. What interests me about the junk rating category, and I look at the intermediate grades and I see Harry Potter, Goosebumps, Lemony Snicket, and in the primary I see things like Frog and Toad, Clifford, Captain Underpants. Captain Underpants has to be like the number one offender. Is that all of these books are the kind of books that I see my students reading, maybe not Captain Underpants or Frog and Toad, but books like Divergent, books like The Hunger Games, books like Twilight. Those are the books that when I reach for an example, that's the book that my kids are all familiar with. And it's not just because of the movie. lots of them have actually read those books, and my kids do not describe themselves as active or very interested readers in their spare time. So to me, it seems like the junk reading is the kind of thing that we need to use as, and this is maybe not the statement I should be making as a government employee, but as a gateway drug. We need to use these junk reading books as the kind of gateway drug that can help them get into books that are somewhat more complex, but that still meet their interests. I'm going to start this story with an obligatory I love my mother, and my mother is one of the best things that has ever happened to me. But I vividly remember something she said to me about series books and junk reading. I so remember being in first grade and coming home with an Animorphs book, which is mentioned by name in the Allington. And my mother sort of looked at it and like paged through it and read the back and said, this is mind candy," which is a phrase that I remember just perfectly. Never mind the fact that I was like 6 years old and reading a chapter book over 100 pages with no pictures. I was kind of impressed with that, but like to my mother, that was still very much mind candy. That was something that was not really worthy of my reading. And obviously, I managed to read a whole bunch of these anyway, and I happen to be a healthy reader without that particular memory scarring me. But I do think that we need to be extremely careful as teachers just to value the reading they do. Not to sit there and say, well, golly, there's a better book you could be reading, but oh, good, you're reading this book. What do you like about it, and where can I find you 20 more just like it? I'm going to give a direct quote real fast. "The classrooms that were best able to put appropriate books in your kids' hands and into their desks had hundreds of titles available in the classroom collection. These titles represented a substantial range of difficulty as well as a range of genres. In other words, these hundreds of books were not typically class sets of a few titles, such as 25 copies of 10 children's books. Although there were in some rooms class sets of particular titles, we more often found smaller sets, say 5 copies, of some titles with the quantity of books accounted for primarily by single copies of many, many books." That quote really struck me, because I know that even the books that I inherited into my class library, a lot of it is class set kind of material, or books that come in 5 or 6. Even the stuff that's high interest to my students, like the Bluford series, is definitely up there on that list. I still think that my students don't have a wide range to look at, and that's something that I know that I need to address as I try to build up a classroom library in the future. I was not surprised, but personally kind of embarrassed when I looked at the section talking about classroom book collections and how the best classroom book collections, I'm quoting here, 500 titles for 5th grade probably works out, but there were exemplary teachers who had classroom collections with about 1,500 books, and I know for certain my classroom collection is nowhere near 1,500 books, and again, my kids wouldn't be able to burn through that many. But I do know that I don't have the kind of numbers that would really support the diverse quantity of readers who come in and the diverse quality of readers who come in. I know that in my own reading life, I've been extremely lucky to grow up in a house that's had more than 1,000 books in it. There was always something else to read and always more encouragement. And right now I feel like I can give out encouragement, but I'm also sending a lot of kids down to the library, or just not having the selection in the classroom that they really ought to have at their fingertips to, get up, find something they like, and read it. I was really not thinking about magazines when I started reading this chapter about matching kids up with books, but it turns out that I was definitely overlooking a really great way to get kids involved. The thing that I like about magazines is that they are probably the closest thing we have to online articles. And I know for my own part, and a lot of the people I read, online articles make up a huge proportion of the stuff that we read on any given day. So the same thing may well apply to the kids. So what I really liked in Allington was noticing that magazines can really fill in the gaps and build up student interest. And maybe unsurprisingly, some of the most popular magazines, which might seem sort of nichey, one of them is a gamer magazine that teenage boys seem to like. But it definitely attracts people because it's just less intimidating than picking up a book. You can pick up a magazine and be done with all of it in half an hour, 45 minutes, and really just pick out the articles that you want to read. So not only does a magazine sort of take some of the fear out of choosing something as big as a book, but I think it also does a really great job of providing students choice because they can choose exactly what it is that they want to read or what they'd rather leave aside. There is a section header in chapter 3 called Putting Books in Their Bedrooms. And this one hit home for me in a very literal way, but also sort of in a figurative way. The idea of being able to go home and having the book there is, in my mind, one of the most important things we can do. It's part of the reason that I think we really overstate the whole idea of about like middle class kids know more words and lower class kids know fewer words. That's partly bad research, but part of it is something that Allington shows throughout the chapter is that these kids just have more exposure to books. The middle class kids have more books at home, more books in their school libraries, which are better funded, and they just have more exposure to reading in their own time. One of the great equalizers has to be making sure that the books can get into the homes of students of whichever social class, and making sure that the funds are available. Allington notes that this is sort of controversial. People don't want to pay money for books, which is fascinating. Um, but at the same time, schools and districts that put out that kind of money find out, A, in the long run, based on what they're paying per student, it's like $30 out of $9,000 per student, so it's really not all that expensive. And second, it's the kind of thing that makes serious gains, not just on test scores, but for this idea of creating lifelong readers. The school book room section of this chapter definitely excited me. This was one of the first things I looked for when I was a new teacher, and it's something that I barely use now. But I am pretty familiar with my school's book room, and I did take a lot of photos of it because I've spent a lot of time in there looking through for useful books to read. First thing to note about the school book room is that Allington definitely sort of pulls, just like he did in the classroom library, for not too much of any one thing, not trying to overwhelm the book room with class sets. The book room where I'm from is basically class sets, and it's not just class sets of, novels and plays, but also class sets, as you can see, of SAT workbooks, of vocabulary workbooks. It's all there, and not all of the stuff in there is technically useful for literacy. There's a checkout list in the school book room for what books you checked out, how many you checked out, and when you took them out and when they come back in. I very much like this page. This page is the full list of all of the books that have been taken out of the school book room since I got there. So it starts in the summer of 2013 and it goes up to last month in January. And this only takes up a page. It only mentions 3 English teachers who are still here. One of those English teachers is only on there once. The other 2 English teachers are coincidentally both Furman graduates from within a year of each other. The reason I bring this up is because we don't represent nearly all of the English teachers at school, first off. Second off, a bunch of these books are just me writing down that I took out The Great Gatsby over and over again. Only once is there a real sense of a lot of different books being taken out for one project that I tried kind of in vain in my first year. This just goes to show that even with some level of organization and some knowledge of the book room, it doesn't mean that people are going to actually go out and use the thing. The inadequacy of school libraries is a topic that I think is sad but also true and definitely borne out in the research. When I was reading this, I saw Stephen Krashen's name in the citations, and I'm like, yes, that is the man. Because Stephen Krashen is the one who says that it's better to have books in the home rather than books in the library. So you can't just solve literacy problems by throwing books into a public library and hoping people show up. I think the same principles definitely applying here, except in the classroom instead of at home. I think you would have more success building up classroom libraries than just school libraries in general. Um, just because, as Allington notes, those school libraries are too often underfunded and understaffed, quote unquote, and we simply see not enough time being given to students, maybe only once a week, to go down and actually visit the library and spend some time and browse through the books and find something that interests them. It seems, especially in elementary school, like it would be very hard to give students inadequate time to sort of take their time and go ahead and find the things that they